North Dakota State Extension economist Frayne Olson is our market analyst this week. Through the first 6 months of the year, foreign demand for U.S. corn, soybeans, and wheat was stronger than a year ago. The value of exports for corn was 19% higher, soybeans were up 27%, and wheat increased 38%. Japan was the top buyer of U.S. corn and the second leading importer of wheat. China, unsurprisingly, accounted for the majority of U.S. beans, and Mexico led the way in wheat. In North Dakota, producers are waiting out a months-long drought. Last week's U.S. Drought Monitor indicated less than 1% of the state had normal moisture conditions. Frayne joined us Tuesday afternoon, and we began by asking how drought has impacted production.
Yeah, so we've got quite a bit of variation in conditions. Visually, if you were to take kind of the state of North Dakota and divide it diagonally, the southwest corner of the state, portion of the state, has had the most severe drought conditions, are the areas that have had most adverse impact on the drought and yield potential. But as you get into the northeast corner of the state, yields are actually going to be, I think, pretty normal. They had a little more rain last fall. They've had a few more rain showers this spring, so that portion of the state's in much better condition. So again, traveling across the state, you've got to be very careful about where you're talking and crop conditions as we move forward.
Well, and about which crop you're talking too, right?
That's correct. We've recently had some rains that have come through the state, in particular along the southern border, along the South Dakota-North Dakota border. And again, that's given some reprieve to some of the drought conditions. For those later season crops like corn and soybeans and sunflowers, it really did give us a chance to kind of catch up. Our daytime temperatures have been a bit cooler, so that again is helping. It wasn't enough rain to be able to recharge and really give us some soil moisture, but it was enough to give some reprieve and I think boost some optimism that the yields may not be quite as bad as we were expecting, especially again on the later season crops.
Spring wheat, though, has been pretty bad, I assume?
Yeah, the spring wheat area, again, as you divide the state, the southwest corner, well, the whole state of North Dakota in particular, but the southwest does produce quite a bit of spring wheat. The northwest corner is really our Durham area, and of course the dry weather extends into some of the wheat growing regions in Montana. So of the spring wheat growing region, a large portion of that right now is under drought or some kind of drought conditions, a little over 50% based on USDA calculations. And again, a lot of that crop has now been harvested or has been baled up for hay as a roughage source for the livestock producers. But again, that northeast corner, as we get closer to the Canadian border and move east into Minnesota, some of those fields look awful good. So I've had some questions about yield potential or yield numbers, especially coming out of both USDA and some of the private reports. And I'll be honest, I think the yield numbers are reasonably close, just because we do have a lot of wheat that's grown in those areas that have some better yield potential.
Well, weather played such a big role in that commodity run-up in July, but since then, can you describe what's happened to those markets?
Yeah, we've, especially for wheat and other markets as well, we tend to have kind of this pendulum swinging sometimes a little too far high on the high side or a little too far on the low side. I think during the real development of the drought in North Dakota and Montana, the spring wheat market over-responded to that. We've seen some retracement in prices, in particular in spring wheat prices. But kind of the kickoff to that and the lower prices we're seeing right now really was the USDA reports, in particular the production estimates for the production estimates for corn and for soybeans. They were lower than the trend line yields, but obviously higher than what the market was expecting. And so that's really put a lot of negative news or negative bias back into the marketplace. And so now I think we've seen those futures market prices retrace quite heavily. Again, moving forward, we'll have to see if those price or yield forecasts hold.
Do you think those prices have gone too far to the downside?
I do. Personally, I do. And I know I'm reading some other analysts and other opinions about what's happening in the marketplace. Right now, we're looking at an oversold position. So if you look at some of the technical indicators we have in the marketplace, it looks like we've sold more contracts than probably necessary. And again, there's this momentum downward. I think we're going to start to see some of that rebound. As we move through the rest of the week, we're going to be starting hearing about some of the private analysts and what their yield expectations and yield reports are. There'll be some more coming out next week. My expectation is that some of the private analysts will come in with slightly lower numbers than what the USDA has been projecting. And just on a sidebar, I do think that as we get into the September and October reports, I think those USDA estimates will also start to move downward or be downward trending, just based on the methodology that they use to come up with those numbers.
What do you think farmers should be focusing on now as they either try to unload old crop or sell some new crop?
Yeah, and I've been getting a lot of questions, especially for old crop corn. There was a few people that I know kind of hanging on, hoping that we'd see a little bit of improvement in basis, or after the August 10th report out of USDA, see some improvement in prices. That would be kind of their incentive to be able to clean out the bins and get some of the old crop moved through the system. And of course, now with the much lower prices, that's become a much more greater challenge. I guess my suggestion, my recommendation is, I think we're on the downside. We'll see a little bit of a rebound, a bounce, probably close to those levels that we saw earlier this summer. I don't think we'll get back up to those levels we saw a month or so ago during, again, the heavy development of the drought in the northern plains. So you just got to be very patient, look for those pricing opportunities, don't get too greedy, and try and move some of the grain through the system. Try and be a diversified investor, if you will, and make sequential sales as we move through.